Hi, this
Hi.
is Gabriel Andrade. I'm broadcasting from the Cayman Islands. And joining me on the other end of the line is Dr. Mary Lefkowitz. She is the author of many books, one of them which is Not Out of Africa, where she has a long scholarship on the ancient world. And today we'll be speaking about Afrocentrism. And I came across, welcome, Doctor.
Thanks so much.
I came across your book a few years ago, maybe 15 years ago in Vancouver, Canada, and in a used bookstore. And I saw this statue of, it was either Aristotle or Socrates with a hat on, with an X, right? And I was always a fan of the Malcolm X movie.
Yeah.
So, it really got my attention. And then later on, I discovered that that wasn't your idea and that you actually thought that that was not a good idea to market the book that way. But let me tell you that at least in my case, it achieved its purpose because it immediately got my attention. Anyways, what is Afrocentrism?
Well, it's a lot of things. The part that I was concerned about was the claim that was made by certain authors that Greek philosophy was stolen from Egypt. And I thought, well, first of all, you can't steal ideas. But secondly, you can't really, well, it wasn't, that's all. There's just no evidence. But then I had to find out why people made that claim, because it didn't come from nowhere. So that got me on a really interesting search.
Right. But it is true that the Greeks did look to the Egyptians every once in a while, right? I mean, Plato talks about myths and all that coming from the Egyptians and so on, right?
Absolutely. No, they learned a lot from Egypt, and they were actually had colonies in Egypt. They were trading colonies. They were kept pretty separate, but they were kind of there. So they were in a position to learn something about Egypt. And Herodotus, the great historian, went to Egypt, and they respected Egypt greatly. But that doesn't mean that philosophy came from there. It means that you can see Egyptian influence really clearly in art, in Greek art. That's where you get it, in architecture.
Not in philosophy.
No, I think that's, I'd be willing to be corrected if any text turned up that showed some signs of that, early texts of Egyptian writers. But it seems to be a Greek thing. And I'm not sure why. I don't think language has anything to do with it. I think all languages are capable of saying a lot of things. So it's not, it's hard to account for it in any way, except that there were these people who were thinking very hard about why things were the way they were, and got away from a religious interpretation of it into something else. And it's taken off from there.
Right. And how does this relate to race? Because so far you've only said that, okay, I mean, it's the claim that some ideas that we've always thought that they were Western, they come from Africa. But at any case, even if they came from Africa, it would be from Northern Africa. And Northern African peoples, they're not really all that dark. So how does it come that dark-skinned people embraced this idea of Afrocentrism? How does the idea of race come into being here?
Well, it's partly that it was an old idea that Egyptian philosophy came, there was an Egyptian university, and that philosophy spread from there to Greece. But that was really it was a fictional novel written in France in the 18th century, and it got into Freemasonry. Freemasonry was a pretty popular way of getting an alternative to religion, an alternative particularly to Catholicism in France. And a lot of people in America, I'd say George Washington and others, were very interested in it as a means of understanding life. And that was all based on this novel, which had universities in Egypt teaching Greek philosophy before the Greeks. It was a fiction, and it was accepted as that. And I think that's how it became the idea became rather popular. But how does it all relate to race? In a way, it really doesn't, except that I don't think the Egyptians were white. I think they were lighter skinned than some people in Africa just for practical reasons. But, skin color depends a lot on where you are. I mean, over the centuries, the reason that that Europeans have bleached out so much is that it's a way of getting more sunlight and more vitamin D into their skin than would come any other way. It's not any other kind of superiority at all. It's just practical. Light colored eyes to see better. But in darker situations, whereas dark colored eyes protect you against the sun. So Mediterranean people tend to have darker colored eyes than Norwegians, say. And then, of course, colonialism gets everything totally mixed up and messed up. But that's another topic. So I guess that's how the idea got started. And, everyone wants to claim the Egyptians, some connection with the Egyptians because their civilization is so interesting and their architecture is so monumental. And I think that's kind of how the idea got into a whole question of race and so on. I wish the whole concept of race didn't exist because it's gotten all mixed up with politics, and it really is not that important. It shouldn't be that important. I know it is, and I know in the United States it's become,
but Afrocentrists do make it important because they make a big deal out of this, right? So their whole claim is that not only did Egyptians are the originators of philosophy, but they were also black. So they're bringing race into this.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Unfortunately, and that just made the whole thing worse because if you said, no, look, this isn't quite what happened, here's what happened and why, then they say, no, you're a racist. And you're doing this because you want to have white supremacy. Well, no, I certainly don't. And I don't think anybody who thinks these arguments don't make any sense or make very little sense thinks that. They just want to get the history straight. At the same time as this Afrocentrism was going on, there was a professor at Cornell named Martin Bernal who wrote a book called Black Athena. And his claim was that Greek civilization had been massively influenced in all levels, not just in art, which is clear, but in everything else. And he was attempting to prove this mainly by etymology. He had a theory that a large chunk of Greek language came from Egypt, and he had rather interesting ways of trying to argue this. I don't think very many of them hold up at all. It just doesn't work that way. I think a lot of Greek words, the origin of Greek words, ancient Greek words, isn't known. A lot of them is maybe more than 50% are known very clearly where they come from. And there are some loan words from Egyptian because, as I said, the Egyptians were in Greece for centuries before philosophy was invented. But I think Greek is basically an Indo-European language, and there are other words that got in there from who knows where, because so many languages were lost. They just didn't have writing, and so it didn't get recorded anyway. At least the Egyptians did have a writing system, and a lot of Egyptian inscriptions and papyri can be read now, but it still isn't a language that's closely related. And that's, people didn't know that. People's ignorance about all this is pretty great. A lot of this stuff isn't taught in schools, and I think the myth of the Greek dependence on Egypt was very popular with many people of African descent in this country, because it made them feel better. It was a way of saying, look, we've been ripped off. We've not been just ripped off by white racism, but this is another example of something that the white racists have done to us and taken not only everything away from us that they possibly can. And I think many people still believe it in spite of everything I and other people have written on this topic. And it's there are terrible things that white supremacy has done in this country, and is continuing to do. And I certainly wouldn't want to support that in any way.
Yeah, but you can't fight racism by coming up with fake histories, right? I mean,
no,
truth is truth, right? And you have to tell the truth. That's the job of the historian.
Because the truth protects everybody. If you start making stuff up, you get to where we are in American politics now. I mean, the president of the United States is one of the greatest maker of things up. He just says what he thinks is true, whether it's true or not. So we're in a kind of mess.
I'm going to put you in the spot here, because since you brought it up, I didn't want to bring this up, but you brought it up. Do you think that maybe Mr. Trump's ascendancy is backlash against things like Afrocentrism?
Oh, sure. I think there's a great deal of resentment. You can see that just in the way President Obama was treated, with people shouting things from the audience. I don't think a member of the House of Representatives should shout at the President of the United States, "You lie," particularly when he wasn't lying. This is the kind of thing that is, to me, very, very shocking. I was so happy when we managed to elect a President of the United States who was African American, and it was really, I thought we had made some strides in this country, and I think some people have. I think many things have improved. Attitudes towards gay people, all kinds of things like that. But there are many people in this country who don't buy that at all. And I hadn't realized how many there were. I'm sitting here in Massachusetts. It's deep blue, as we say. It's a very democratic state for the most part. The Republicans here were pretty far left for Republicans, and it isn't representative of the United States as a whole.
Sure, but I mean, the point that I was trying to raise is that whether or not, if Afrocentrists keep persisting, pushing their agenda, ultimately they're feeding the monster, and they're providing Trump with a platform to go and say, look, with the ridiculous stuff that they teach in universities and school, that's why you need me as president, in order to prevent that.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's absolutely true. This just makes it worse. And what everyone should say is, look, as long as you acknowledge the great achievements of peoples in Africa for what they are, and don't claim that these people were white, which of course I think is correct, that they were not white, then they take pride in that, and just let the Greeks have their own philosophy and go on from there. I think we should explore influence of other civilization on ancient Greece so far as we can. I think people have done that for a very long time. But the trouble is there's just not enough evidence to go beyond a certain point. So,
sure. As far as I know, Afrocentrists, and you work a little bit with this in your book, they make a big deal out of Cleopatra. And you've told us that, okay, ancient Egyptians were not really white, so I guess we can accept that Cleopatra was nothing like Elizabeth Taylor. But on the other hand, Afrocentrists say, well, but she may look more like Beyonce or something like that, right? I mean, like really dark skin and so on. What's your take on it? And why do they focus so much on Cleopatra? What does Cleopatra have that makes it so appealing to Afrocentrists?
Well, she's famous, She's famous and she's important. And if it's a total lie that, she was a Greek, but I think it's pretty clear that she was basically a Hellenistic Greek. We don't know who her mother and grandmother were particularly. I mean, in any specific way, we don't know for sure. And that's one reason why the idea that she could be black got started. There were certainly black people working for and with the Ptolemies who controlled Egypt. There were, or at least Egyptians were working there. There could have been Nubians, but the trouble is there could have been Persians, and there could even have been Jews, because there were a lot of those people in places like Alexandria as well. So that complicates the picture. Just because you don't know exactly who some of her ancestors were doesn't mean that they were necessarily black. I think the whole situation is different in the American South, because there were a lot of black mothers of who had white fathers, not so much the other way around. But that's about America in the 18th and early 19th century. It's certainly not about Egypt. And I think the evidence is, the likelihood is very strong that Cleopatra was descended from one of the generals of Alexander the Great, and she was probably, she's Greek. She was unlike her predecessors, because she learned various languages, various local languages, and she has herself represented as a pharaoh, because that's what she was in Egyptian terms. But so that's another thing that's come up an awful lot. But I think the evidence is not very much in favor of her being African.
Yeah, because in the book you mentioned that the dynasty from which Cleopatra was part, they pretty much lived secluded from the rest of Egyptians, right? So they lived pretty much in their own palace, and it was all Greek people there.
Yeah.
Whereas the Egyptians that they came to colonize, they lived, sometimes they were not even allowed in some cities, right? Such as Alexandria. So they would have to be either on the outskirts of the city or somewhere else. So there wasn't much opportunity for mixing of the new Hellenistic dynasty with the native Egyptians.
No, there wasn't very much, and some of them didn't even speak any of the local languages. These people, they were just rulers who would come in from outside. We've had many cases of that in history. I think if she had been African or noticeably African in any way, the Romans would certainly have said something about it, because the Romans were there, they'd taken over, and they certainly recognized these things.
Sure. Another thing about Alexandria that Afrocentrists talk a lot about is that they claim that Aristotle stole philosophy from some books that were in the Alexandria library, and you debunk this claim. Tell us a little bit what the Afrocentrists claim and what their real history is like.
Well, the claim was principally made by a man named, or who called himself Yosef A. Ben Yochanan. He actually was an American. He claimed that he was from Puerto Rico for a while. Then he claimed he was a Palasha Jew. I don't think he was necessarily any of those things, but he died recently, and he just said he didn't have any evidence for it, that Aristotle stole his philosophy from the library in Alexandria. He took the books off the shelves, or they weren't books, they were papyrus rolls, and he took them off and just corrected them and made them his own. I mean, this is just crazy, because it didn't. The Library of Alexandria wasn't built until after Aristotle's death, and it's just an idea that it's just a claim that was made that it doesn't have any historical value. So I don't think there's no evidence that that Aristotle ever went to the Library at Alexandria in his life, or into Alexandria itself. He didn't go with Alexander the Great, who was his pupil, but had long since stopped being his pupil when he started his conquest. I don't think he went anywhere with him. He stayed in Greece. So and in Macedonia. So that's what happened. So that was the craziest claim of all. And I got a lot in a certain amount of trouble for saying so when this man, Ben Yochanan, came to give a lecture. But it seemed to me I couldn't, as an academic, as a professor at Wellesley College, sit there when someone was saying something so completely off the wall, because students are there to learn, and to learn how to think, and to learn how to judge ideas, and they have to be presented with the correct evidence and all the evidence, and not just have people sort of declaim at them without any evidence at all. And that's one of the great problems. This is still happening. It's not it's not anything that Afrocentrists only do. People will claim all kinds of things all the time, and people really have got to stand up and say something.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, when I was reading your book some years ago, and recently in preparation for this, I went over it again. Reading your book and reading your descriptions of what Afrocentrists believe, I found some resemblances in some of those old ridiculous books. I don't know if you're aware of them, written by Eric von Daniken.
Oh yeah.
But this idea that like the pyramids, they had to be built by aliens because it's impossible that Africans would have the brains to do it, right? Or Mexicans or whoever. And it seems to me that Afrocentrists are reasoning in the same way, as if saying it's impossible that Europeans were able to come up with philosophy since they're so evil, right? I mean, it's this sense of nationalism / racism going on, right?
Right.
Behind all this reasoning.
Well, I know it's just you can flip racism either way. You can be racist against whites or racist against blacks, and it's still racism, and it's still wrong just because racism is really terrible. Whoever does it to whom, it doesn't matter. Now, Eric von Daniken, and there are a lot of other crazy theories that have been going around, and people believe them, and people have got to stand up and say, no, this isn't true, and explain why. And I think no one wanted to be called a racist, and of course that's what happened, is that anyone who could said, oh, you're a racist, you're only saying that because you're white. And then the other thing I got is you're only saying that because you're Jewish, and Jews are terrible people. I mean, all this stuff comes up, and it isn't as if we haven't seen the terrible consequences of racism and of anti-Semitism, certainly in my lifetime.
Of course. How do you avoid being called a racist if you just speak the truth?
I don't think you can. I think you got to speak it, and you got to hope that no one does anything really bad to you. Words don't hurt. I mean, they hurt, but you get over it. You can recover from them. And I just kept trying to say this because I think students, particularly students, but everybody really needs to learn how to look at evidence and look at and judge things for themselves, and not just listen to people tell them stuff, and believe people without being sure that the people know what they're saying. And terrible ideas are out there, and I'm still very glad I did that, even though it was very painful at the time. And I believe that Martin Bernal's ideas were very acceptable in academia, because he was saying that, look, classicists, people like me who do study ancient Greek and Latin, are all racist because they are basically tried to suppress the importance of Egypt and the Egyptian influence on Greek civilization. And that was crazy too. Bernal was a white man, so it was easier to criticize him in a way, because he couldn't accuse me of racism against him. I rather liked him as a person. He was a well-educated guy, and he was intelligent and fun to talk to. But he just had this bee in his bonnet that classicists were dumb. He said all classicists can do is learn conjugations, verb conjugations, and declensions, and spend all their time doing that. Well, that isn't true either. But I don't think it. I think any course of study improves your mind.
Sure. Another thing I find ironic is that there have been classicists who acknowledge, and I think with good evidence, that there were blacks who achieved high positions in both Greece and Rome. I'm thinking of Frank Snowden's famous books on how blacks were able to find good positions in both Greece and Rome. So what need is there for Afrocentrists to make these ridiculous claims when black people themselves were able to achieve great things even in classical civilizations?
Well, I guess I think being a victim is, in a way, sometimes gets you sympathy, and it helps you understand why I think the way black people have been treated in the United States up until this day and particularly in the south of the United States, but in the north too, uh, is uh, is terrible. And things are getting better, but they're not better enough. But this isn't why. The past, it has nothing to do with this. It has to do with uh, the way um, black people were brought to this country as slaves and not given a proper chance and proper education. As that changes, I think the racism will begin to go away. But as we've seen, it's not easy to change anybody's feelings about anything. Right. I I've learned a lot from talking with people throughout the country about these things, and I think it was probably very educational for me as well. But I don't think suppressing the truth is ever a good way to go, and I certainly don't appreciate the way the Republican Party does that. All politicians, exaggerate to a certain extent, but to say that it's good for the country to give very wealthy people more money and more, and that will somehow trickle down. That was Reagan's old idea. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, of course. Do you see any parallels between Afrocentrism and the myth of the lost Jewish tribes or Israeli tribes? Because this is a myth that has always got my attention. Like, for instance, when Europeans began to come to the Americas, they would see the natives and they say, well, maybe they're one of the lost tribes, right?
Yeah.
So whatever they built, it wasn't actually them. It actually goes all the way back to Israel. Yeah. And it was the same in Japan and in Afghanistan, in many of these places where the alleged the lost 12 tribes, not the 12, but the 10 remaining, because Judah and Benjamin remain. But the other 10, the European colonialism began to see natives as part of the lost tribes. And it seems to me that there is some parallelism here with Afrocentrism in the sense that they are seeing other people interpreting their origin through their own lens. Tell me about that parallelism, if you see any.
Well, yeah, I mean, I could see that. The whole idea of the Native Americans, indigenous people, being the lost tribe of Israel is preserved in Mormonism still to this day. And it's really no particular evidence for it. And it's, I just, all these emphasizing race, which after all really isn't a real thing, is just bad for everybody. Because it's just, I don't know how to put it right, but anthropologists don't really like to talk about race. They talk about clines, that is, genetic affinity groups that are related to each other. So it's like clans or people like that. And of course, they're going to have different physical characteristics and perhaps mental characteristics too, in that some things are more easily permitted by some societies than others. So that's about all I think is true. I think the whole concept of race is just useless and has just done damage, and I just wish it would go away. And of course, it's going to take an awful lot more than I thought to get it to do so. Human beings basically have a tough time being rational.
But you know what? There is a trend in the US right now, and this is coming from the left, not from the right, in which they say that people who make the argument that you just made, and I subscribe to it as well, but they would accuse us, both you and I, of being colorblind racists.
Yeah.
And they would claim that in the way you analyze society and in the way that you tell history, you have to bring the elements of race, because if you're blind to race, and if you want it to disappear, as presumably you do and I do, we're complicit in racism itself. Do you have any reply to that?
I don't know how you deal with that kind of argument. I mean, we all look the way we do, and that's, and maybe there are other characteristics, I don't know. Tendency to certain, certainly within the concept of genetic relationship, there are certain people are more susceptible to certain diseases than others, and there's all that. But I don't think you can ignore race because it's as a concept because it clearly means something to a lot of people, and so therefore you have to acknowledge it. Um, and but I don't think that you can do any more than that. You have to say it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is your values in society, and I think uh, that and I would argue that yes, you can speak a dialect of English, but if you're going to really want to write well, then you just got to speak standard English because that's communicates with more people. It's just a practical thing.
Of course. Well, one final question that I had here. At the beginning of our conversation, you said that Afrocentrist claims don't hold water, amongst other things, because you can't steal ideas. Those were your words.
Yeah.
This is coming back today in 2019 in America with the whole concept of cultural appropriation, because it seems that some people believe that you can indeed steal ideas and that ideas have property and that one cultural group cannot take ideas from another cultural group because, well, that's more or less like a crime. So what's your counter to that?
Oh, I just hope they're good ideas if they're taking them and not bad ideas. That would be the great thing. I mean, I think that's one of the wonderful things about the original idea of America was that we could all learn from each other. That certain foods, for example, which I never ate when I was a kid, and I'm now eating all the time now because they're available. And people are trying new things in every nationality of restaurant, and everything like that is available, even in a small place. Partly because there are a lot of immigrants, and partly because people are now open to trying new ideas. I think nothing really is so much. Let me put it the other way: so much of human experience is learned, and so relatively little of it is inherited in any way. You know, you learn it from your environment and from the opportunities you have or don't have, and that is what determines a lot. And that I really believe that I think I'd be a very strange kind of educator if I didn't believe that all people could be educated. Um, Now, what they want to learn and what they can learn may differ because not everybody's good at math, you know, or good at Greek. But it's I think that we should all strive towards learning from each other. It just seems to me to be so basic, but I don't know. That's why it all was so upsetting because, you know, there's these sort of fundamental beliefs I had that human beings could learn from each other and that we were all created equal and all this stuff. And, you know, suddenly everyone says, no, you're not defending that. I don't know. I met some very interesting people and I learned a lot from the whole thing. So I guess I'm grateful it happened.
Of course, of course. Well, we've learned a lot from you in this half an hour. Are you working on any new project?
Well, I'm mostly working on classical stuff now. Nothing very controversial. Though, you know, this has been my training mostly has been, and so that's what I'm doing now. I'm talking about Greek attitudes towards foreigners in part, and which weren't altogether nice. In fact, sometimes really things we wouldn't approve of very much. But it's worth.
Yeah, I mean, they did call them barbarians, right?
They called them barbarians, and they thought they all had certain national characteristics which they didn't necessarily have. Though that changes over time too. So I've been working on stuff like that, and
yeah, but it was never on the basis of biology, right? I mean, one can agree to that. So
no, that's right.
Discrimination on the basis of biology, it's a modern thing, not an ancient thing.
They were, you know, people spoke different languages and worshiped different gods. But the one thing about polytheism as opposed to monotheism, they just said, oh, well, the Egyptians have these gods. That's great. We'll worship them too. Or this god is like our god so-and-so, so we'll worship her or him, and they just accepted religion as being something that was natural for people, whatever it was, and respected those gods. That kind of religious prejudice that has been so characteristic of the 20th century anyway, and 19th century, and maybe the 21st century, it seems, looking at what some of these horrible white supremacists were saying and doing in, say, Charlottesville a couple of years ago. That seems to me to be, a way in ancient civilization, certainly Greek civilization, was superior.
Dr. Mary Lefkowitz, our pleasure to have you here.
Well, thanks a lot. It's a great, interesting questions. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Indeed.